Chris had always known he was handsome but never thought it would bring him so much trouble. From the moment he stepped into high school, his presence turned heads. He wasn't just another good-looking student, he was something special. His deep brown eyes had a way of drawing people in. His perfectly structured face made him look like he had walked out of a movie, and his tall, athletic build made him stand out even more. Every year, the school held a contest for the most handsome student, and every year, Chris won without a challenge. Even those who tried to compete knew they had no chance. Girls screamed his name in the hallways. Some wrote love letters and slipped them into his locker, while others followed him around, hoping to get a few words out of him. But it wasn't just the female students who admired him. The female teachers, too, seemed unable to resist his charm. Miss Betty, the young and beautiful literature teacher, always kept him after class. "Chris, you are such a bright student," she would say, smiling in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. "I'm sure you'll do great things in the future." But her compliment always came with a strange warmth in her voice, as if she wasn't just talking about his intelligence. Miss Linda, the chemistry teacher, was known for being strict. She rarely smiled in class, and students feared her temper. But when Chris was around, she was different. Her voice softened when she spoke to him. She never scolded him, even when he made mistakes on his assignments. Even Mrs. Dawson, the oldest teacher in school, looked at him in a way that wasn't normal for a teacher to look at a student. She would stare at him for too long, her eyes filled with something unexplainable. Chris felt trapped. At first, he had enjoyed the attention. What teenage boy wouldn't? But soon, it became overwhelming. Girls fought over him, teachers treated him differently, and no one seemed to care about who he really was as a person. They only saw his face, his body, his perfection. And while most of his classmates admired him, there was one person who didn't. His best friend, Ben. Ben had been Chris's friend since childhood. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, played together as kids, and even promised to always have each other's backs. But high school changed everything. Chris became popular. Ben didn't. Chris was the center of attention. Ben was invisible. And Ben hated it. At first, it was just small things. When Chris won his first Most Handsome Student award, Ben forced a smile and clapped with everyone else, but inside, he was fuming. When girls surrounded Chris, Ben stood in the background, pretending he didn't care. But deep inside, he burned with jealousy. As time passed, that jealousy grew into something darker. Ben started noticing how even the teachers treated Chris differently. He saw how Miss Betty smiled only at Chris. He saw how Miss Linda ignored everyone else's mistakes but corrected Chris with a playful tone. He saw how even Mrs. Dawson's eyes followed Chris wherever he went. And it drove him insane. Why is it always him? Ben thought to himself. Why does he get everything? The looks, the attention, the love. Ben knew that Chris never asked for any of this. Chris wasn't arrogant, nor did he treat anyone badly. But that didn't matter. Ben wanted the attention. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to be admired. And most of all, he wanted Chris to suffer. One afternoon, during the lunch break, Ben sat with a group of students who also disliked Chris. Some of them were jealous, just like Ben. Others were just tired of hearing Chris's name everywhere. "He's not even that special," one of them muttered, stabbing his fork into his food. "Yeah," another boy added. "If he wasn't so handsome, no one would care about him. Ben leaned forward, lowering his voice. Then let's make sure people stop caring about him. The others looked at him, confused. What do you mean? One of them asked. Ben smirked. His heart pounded with excitement as his plan formed in his mind. I have a way to get rid of him, he whispered. For good. The group fell silent. Even they weren't expecting something this serious. Meanwhile, across the cafeteria, Miss Betty had just walked in. She was heading toward the teacher's table when she noticed Ben and his group. She didn't like the look in Ben's eyes. It sent chills down her spine. Something wasn't right. She slowed her steps, pretending to be looking for something in her bag. But in reality, she was listening. We have to be smart, Ben continued. We can't just fight him or spread rumors. That won't work. He leaned in even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to make sure he's gone. One of the boys swallowed nervously. Gone. What do you mean? Ben's eyes darkened. I mean, we poison him. A heavy silence filled the table. The air felt thick, suffocating. Some of the boys glanced at each other, unsure if Ben was joking or not. But the look on his face told them he was serious. Miss Betty felt her breath hitch. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Did she hear that correctly? Poison. Her heartbeat quickened. Chris, completely unaware of what was happening, sat at his usual table, laughing with some of his classmates. His bright smile lit up the room, as it always did. He had no idea that his own best friend was plotting against him. And so, the first step of Ben's evil plan had begun. Ben's plan was now in motion. The next step was execution. He had already convinced a few other students to help him, but not all of them were fully committed. Some were hesitant. Poisoning someone wasn't just a prank, it was dangerous. It could get them expelled. It could even get them arrested. But Ben didn't care. He had spent years living in Chris's shadow, and now, he finally had a chance to change things. During the next lunch break, Ben and his group sat together again, speaking in low voices. We'll do it tomorrow, Ben said firmly. His voice was steady, his eyes cold. We have to be careful. It has to look like an accident. One of the boys shifted uncomfortably. But, what if he gets really sick? What if he? Ben cut him off. We're not going to kill him. Just enough to make him suffer. Just enough to take away his perfect life. There was silence. No one spoke. Some of them looked unsure, but no one dared to challenge Ben. The plan was simple. One of the students, who worked part-time at a local pharmacy, managed to get his hands on a bottle of powdered laxative. Ben had wanted something stronger. Something that would put Chris in the hospital. But this was the best they could do without raising suspicion. The plan was to mix the powder into Chris's food while he wasn't looking. It would be strong enough to make him violently ill, humiliating him in front of the entire school. No more perfect image. No more admiration. Just Chris, weak and helpless, suffering in front of everyone. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen. He imagined Chris collapsing in the cafeteria, gasping for air. He imagined the teachers rushing to help him, the students whispering in shock. And most of all, he imagined the way people would look at him after it was all over. For once, they wouldn't be looking at Chris. They would be looking at him. But what Ben didn't know was that someone else had been listening. Miss Betty sat in her dimly lit apartment, replaying everything she had overheard in the cafeteria. She had been watching Ben closely for weeks, sensing his growing hatred for Chris. But she never imagined he would go this far. She knew she had to stop it. But how? If she confronted Ben, he would deny everything. If she told the principal, they would demand proof. And if she went straight to Chris, he might not believe her. Miss Betty clenched her fists. There was only one way to handle this. She had to catch them in the act. The next day the cafeteria was packed, as always. The sound of students talking and laughing filled the air. The smell of fresh food drifted through the room. Chris walked in, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Ben was already there, waiting for him. His heart pounded in his chest. Everything was set. The powder had been mixed into Chris's meal. All he had to do was wait. Chris grabbed his tray, smiling as he greeted a few friends along the way. He sat down at his usual spot, completely relaxed. Then, the moment came. He picked up his spoon, about to take his first bite. Suddenly, a loud scream cut through the air. "Chris, stop!" The entire cafeteria went silent. Everyone turned to see Miss Betty standing at the entrance, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. Chris froze, confused. "Miss Betty." She rushed toward him, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. "Don't eat that," she said, her voice firm. Whispers filled the room. Students looked at each other in shock. What was going on? Ben's heart started racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Miss Betty, what are you talking about?" Chris asked, completely lost. She turned to Ben, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "If the food isn't poisoned, then eat it yourself." A thick silence filled the air. Ben felt his stomach drop. His hands turned cold. Chris looked at his best friend, waiting for an answer. "Ben." Ben forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. Why would I?" "Eat it," Miss Betty repeated. Ben stared at the food. He could feel everyone watching him. His throat went dry. If he refused, they would know. If he ate it, he would suffer the same fate he had planned for Chris. His hands shook as he pushed the tray away. I can't," he whispered. Gasps echoed across the cafeteria. Chris's face changed. For the first time, he saw something in Ben's eyes that he had never noticed before. Hatred. Pure, burning hatred. Chris slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You were going to poison me?" His voice was low, filled with disbelief. Ben clenched his fist, his body trembling. He had been caught. There was no escape. Tears welled up in his eyes, but they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of frustration. He had spent years being ignored, living in Chris's shadow. And now, everything was ruined. "I was never good enough, was I?" Ben's voice cracked. "No one ever saw me. No one ever cared. It was always you, Chris. Always." Chris stared at him, speechless. Miss Betty crossed her arms. "Jealousy doesn't justify hurting someone, Ben." The principal arrived moments later, and Ben was escorted out of the cafeteria along with the other students involved. Chris sat back down, his hands shaking. He had been seconds away from eating poisoned food. His own best friend had betrayed him. But through the chaos, one thing became clear. Miss Betty had saved his life. And from that day forward, their connection would only grow stronger. The cafeteria incident changed everything. Chris was no longer the same carefree boy who walked through school without a worry. He had come face to face with betrayal, and it left a deep scar in his heart. His closest friend, someone he had trusted since childhood, had plotted against him out of jealousy. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. Ben had wanted to see him suffer. Ben and the others involved were expelled the very next day. The principal made the announcement in front of the entire school, sending a clear message that such actions would not be tolerated. But even as Ben left the school grounds for the last time, Chris couldn't shake the feeling of unease. If his best friend could turn against him, who else was secretly waiting for his downfall? The once bright and exciting high school life now felt different. The looks he received from students were no longer just admiration. Some were whispers of pity, others were filled with curiosity. He could feel their eyes on him wherever he went. Some were wondering if he had known about Ben's hatred all along. Others were questioning if he was really as perfect as he seemed. But through all of this, there was one person who stood by him. Miss Betty. After that day in the cafeteria, their relationship changed. Chris had always seen Miss Betty as just another teacher, one of the many who seemed overly interested in him. But after she saved his life, something shifted. He started noticing things about her that he never paid attention to before. The way she always seemed to be nearby, watching out for him. The way she spoke to him differently than she did with other students, gentler, warmer. The way her eyes softened whenever they met his. At first, he told himself that it was just gratitude. She had risked her reputation to protect him. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. One afternoon, a few weeks after the poisoning incident, Chris stayed behind after school. His mind was restless, and he found himself wandering through the empty hallways. Without thinking, his feet led him toward Miss Betty's classroom. She was inside, sitting at her desk, flipping through a book. The warm glow of the setting sun cast a golden light into the room, making the scene feel almost surreal. Chris hesitated at the door. He knew he should turn back, but something kept him there. Miss Betty looked up, surprised but pleased to see him. "Chris, what are you still doing here?" He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. I don't know. I didn't feel like going home yet." She nodded in understanding. "I can imagine. It hasn't been easy for you." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't get it. Ben and I were friends since we were kids. I never did anything to him. I never tried to outshine him. But he still hated me." Miss Betty leaned forward, resting her elbows on her desk. "Sometimes, people don't need a reason to be jealous. They see someone who has what they don't, and it eats them up inside. That jealousy turns into hatred, and before they know it, they're willing to do anything to take that person down." Chris let her words sink in. He had spent so much time trying to figure out what he had done wrong, but maybe the truth was simple, he hadn't done anything wrong at all. A moment of silence passed between them before Miss Betty spoke again. "You should be careful, Chris." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She closed her book and stood up, walking to the window. Ben wasn't the only one who felt that way. There are others. Students, maybe even teachers. You stand out too much. And when someone stands out, they attract both admiration and danger. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. She turned back to him, her expression serious. I'm saying this because I care about you. You need to start paying attention to the people around you. Not everyone who smiles at you has good intentions. Chris nodded slowly. I get it. She studied him for a moment before giving him a small smile. But you're not alone. If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Something about the way she said those words made his heart race. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to her in a way that went beyond gratitude. He quickly shook the thought away. She was his teacher. But then again, after high school, that wouldn't matter anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Chris found himself seeking Miss Betty's company more often. He would stay after class just to talk. Sometimes, they would sit in comfortable silence. Other times, they would have deep conversations about life, about dreams, about the future. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't just beautiful, she was smart, understanding, and mature. She didn't see him as just a pretty face. She saw him as a person. But the more time they spent together, the more people began to notice. Rumors started spreading. Students whispered in the hallways about how Chris and Miss Betty were too close. Some claimed they had seen them alone together too many times. Others suggested that Miss Betty had always had a special interest in Chris. And then there were the teachers. Miss Linda, the chemistry teacher, was the first to bring it up. She cornered Miss Betty in the staff room one morning. You should be careful, she said with a forced smile. People are starting to talk. Miss Betty kept her expression neutral. Talk about what? Miss Linda raised an eyebrow. Oh, come on. You and Chris. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. There's nothing inappropriate happening. Miss Linda leaned in slightly. Maybe not yet. But the way you look at him, the way you protect him. You're walking a dangerous line, Betty. Miss Betty didn't respond, but her heart was pounding. She wasn't foolish. She knew the risks. But she also knew one thing for certain, Chris meant something to her. And she wasn't going to let anyone scare her away from him. Meanwhile, Chris was facing his own problems. Despite Ben being gone, Chris still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he walked down the hallways, he could feel the stares. Some were admiring, others were suspicious. One afternoon, as he was packing up his things, a note slipped out of his locker. At first, he thought it was another love letter. He got them all the time. But as he unfolded the paper, his breath caught in his throat. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone who smiles at you is your friend. His heartbeat quickened. Who sent this? Was this another warning? Or was it a threat? For the first time in his life, Chris wasn't just admired. He was being haunted. The warning note haunted Chris for days. He kept it in his pocket, rereading it over and over, trying to figure out who had sent it. Was it a friend? A secret enemy? Or maybe, someone on the inside? Miss Betty's words echoed in his mind, not everyone who smiles at you has good intentions. He had already learned that lesson the hard way with Ben. But was there someone else waiting to betray him? Something inside him told him that this wasn't over. One evening, Chris stayed late in the library, hoping that the quiet would help him clear his thoughts. Most of the students had already gone home, and the school was eerily silent. As he packed up his things, he noticed something strange. A shadow moved outside the library door. Chris frowned. "Hello." No answer. Slowly, he stepped outside and looked around. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the stress was getting to him. But then, a sharp sound echoed through the hallway. A locker slammed shut. Chris's heartbeat quickened. He turned the corner just in time to see a figure disappear down the hallway. He didn't know why, but his instinct told him to follow. His footsteps were silent as he moved through the dimly lit hallways. Whoever it was, they were moving fast, almost as if they knew he was behind them. Finally, they turned into an empty classroom. Chris hesitated for a brief moment before pushing the door open. Inside, standing by the window, was someone he never expected to see. Miss Linda, the chemistry teacher. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Chris." Chris's eyes narrowed. "Why are you sneaking around?" Miss Linda sighed, crossing her arms. "I should be asking you the same thing. You've been acting different ever since Ben left." Chris's grip tightened on his backpack. "Did you leave this in my locker?" He pulled out the note. Miss Linda's eyes flicked to the paper. She let out a small laugh. "Oh, Chris, you're so naive." Chris's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said that made him uneasy. "What's that supposed to mean?" Miss Linda took a step closer. "You think Ben was the only one who envied you? That he was the only one who wanted to see you fall?" Chris's hands went cold. She continued, her voice soft but dangerous. "You've spent years walking through this school, charming everyone without even trying. The girls adore you. The teachers," she smirked, "some of them would do anything just to have your attention." Chris's breath hitched. Miss Linda's gaze darkened. "But you never noticed me, did you?" A chill ran down Chris's spine. "What are you talking about?" Miss Linda let out a small sigh. "It doesn't matter anymore. You've already chosen her." Her. Chris's mind immediately went to Miss Betty. Was this about her? "Miss Betty always thought she could outsmart me," Miss Linda murmured, shaking her head. "She always acted so perfect, so noble. But I know the truth. I know she's just like the rest of them. She wants you, Chris." Chris took a step back, his heart pounding. Miss Linda smiled. "But don't worry. She won't have you." Before Chris could react, she reached into her bag. His instincts kicked in, and he jumped back just as she threw something toward him. A fine, white powder filled the air. Chris coughed, stumbling backward. His vision blurred for a moment, but he managed to stay on his feet. The powder hadn't hit him directly, but he knew what it was. Chemicals. She had tried to drug him. Panic surged through his body as he turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, all he knew was that he needed to get out. Footsteps pounded behind him. She was chasing him. Chris's mind raced. No one was around. The school was empty. Suddenly, a door swung open in front of him. "Chris." Miss Betty's voice. Without thinking, he darted inside. Miss Betty slammed the door shut behind him and locked it. They were in her classroom. Chris's breath was heavy as he turned to her. She tried to. I know. Miss Betty's face was serious, her hands trembling slightly. I knew she was watching you. I knew she hated me for being close to you. But I didn't think she would go this far. A loud bang on the door made Chris flinch. Miss Linda was outside. Chris, come out, she called in a sing-song voice. Don't listen to her. She's manipulating you. Miss Betty grabbed Chris's wrist. We need to get out of here. Now. Chris nodded. They slipped out through the back door of the classroom and ran through the empty halls. Behind them, they could hear Miss Linda screaming in frustration. Finally, they reached the school's front entrance. Just as they burst outside, they nearly ran into the principal, along with 2 security guards. Miss Linda is inside. Miss Betty shouted. She tried to attack Chris. The principal's face hardened. He nodded to the security guards, who rushed inside. Moments later, they dragged the screaming Miss Linda out of the building. I did it for you, Chris, she shrieked. She's lying to you. She's using you. Chris turned away, his stomach twisting. It was over. Miss Linda was fired immediately. Chris was called in for questioning, but after reviewing the security footage, the school board confirmed that he was the victim. Miss Betty's quick thinking had saved him once again. The incident left the school in shock. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some students were horrified. Others, strangely, seemed jealous. As for Chris, he had changed. He wasn't just a handsome high school student anymore. He wasn't just the boy everyone admired. He had seen the darkness that jealousy could create. And he had survived it. After graduation, Chris and Miss Betty went their separate ways. Or at least, that's what the world believed. But whispers floated around. Some claimed that Chris and Miss Betty had stayed in contact. That their connection had only grown stronger after he left high school. No one knew for sure. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly how they wanted it.